Hi guys, this is day 32 of the AS Economics Revision Challenge, and today we are doing causes of inflation. When we look at causes of inflation, we identify three reasons. The first one is what we call demand pull inflation. Demand pull inflation basically happens if there's a rise in aggregate demand and that results in the price level to rise. The second reason what we identify is what we call cost push inflation. The cost push inflation is where there is a rise in the cost of major commodities and inputs as well as goods that results in the price level of the economy to rise. And the last one is what we call monetary inflation, where a rise in money supply can also result in price level to rise. So this video will talk about all the three causes in detail. Let's start with the demand pull inflation. Any rise in C, I, G or X minus M can result in demand pull inflation to happen. We know this that AD is made up of C plus I plus G plus X minus M. So any rise in C, I, G or X minus M can make the AD go up, and if the AD goes up when the economy doesn't have the spare capacity to meet the increased demand, to meet the increased demand can cause basically the price level to go up. So if the AD is rising, that's good news for an economy, because when the AD goes up, there is a rise in demand causing a rise in output. But there could be a possibility that the economy may not have the spare capacity to meet the increased demand, because demand might be rising too much and the inputs are not there to meet that increased demand. If that happens, then there will be a pressure on prices to rise, and that pressure on prices will cause what we call demand pull inflation. I'm going to show this in terms of a diagram. So on my y-axis, I'm going to make my price level. We have price level on the y-axis, and on the x-axis we have real GDP. So let's assume right now AD is meeting AS at, for example, P naught, and the GDP is at Y naught. And let's say if there is a rise in AD, a rise in AD will cause the price level to rise, and therefore, although GDP does go up, but because the price level goes up, we are looking at demand pull inflation to happen. Now, the reason why demand pull inflation happens here is because AS curve is upward sloping. If the economy had spare capacity, then we may not see inflation to happen. For example, let's say if AS was like this. If AS was like this, and if I say that there is a rise in AD, there is a rise in AD like something like this from AD naught to AD1, you will not see any pressure on prices to happen, because the economy has the flexibility or spare capacity to meet the increased demand. But in this case, the economy did not have the spare capacity, and as a result, a rise in AD is causing demand pull inflation to happen. So demand pull inflation can come from any rise in CIG or an X minus M. For example, let's say if businesses are excessively optimistic or confident about the economy, then they may invest more, and that can make the AD go up. Similarly, surging exports or strong exports can make the AD to rise as well. Or, for example, consumers may end up causing consumption to rise, and therefore demand pull inflation to happen. But the more important thing that we need to remember this is that demand pull inflation happens due to a rise in AD, but the economy has an inability to meet that increased demand, which causes the prices to rise. If the economy doesn't have any problem in terms of, for example, let's say economy has spare capacity or economy has unused capacity, then therefore demand pull inflation may not occur. On the other hand, when we look at cost push inflation happens when there's a continuing rises in costs and therefore continuing leftward shift of the aggregate supply curve. Such shift will occur when there is a rise in cost of production. Let me write this: rise in cost of production independently of the aggregate demand. So irrespective or independently of the aggregate demand, if the cost of production goes up, which means that there will be cost push inflation. Now there could be many causes of cost push inflation, but before that I'm going to show that in terms of diagram. How do we show cost push inflation? So in the cost push inflation, aggregate supply curve will be shifting backward. Why? Because the cost of production is going up, and that causes the price level to rise. So real GDP on the x-axis, price level on the y-axis, and when we make our AD naught AS naught, there is a shift of the aggregate supply curve backward, causing the price level to rise from P0 to P1, and therefore you will see your inflation to happen. Now this is where, look at this guys, not only prices are rising, but the economy is also slowing down because the GDP is falling, something which Pakistan is currently facing. The petrol prices are going up, the exchange rate is appreciating. Pakistan is finding itself to suffer from cost push inflation, where higher prices and falling GDP isn't really helping the cause. So what are the causes of cost push inflation? Well, we identify many causes of cost push inflation, but the first one could be what we call wage push inflation. Wage push inflation simply means if, for example, trade unions become really powerful and they end up causing or bargain a higher wage, then that could basically mean cost of production will go up. So let me write this here: trade unions negotiate higher wages, and that leads to cost of production to rise and therefore AS to fall. The second reason which can result in such inflation to happen could be what we call profit push inflation. Profit push inflation is simply if the economy has monopoly power. So monopoly powers can result in basically higher profit or seek higher profits, and that higher profits may lead to what we call higher prices and therefore aggregate supply to fall. So this is where monopoly powers are basically seeking better margins, may cause artificially the cost of production to go up and the prices to go up because they are now very powerful. The third one is basically what we call imported inflation. Imported inflation is basically something which Pakistan is kind of like suffering right now, where Pakistan exchange rate somehow has gone down, imports have become expensive. So when imported goods become expensive, your cost of production go up. So if key inputs are imported and they become expensive, then basically aggregate supply curve will fall as cost of production rises. So that's the third reason why you'll see, for example, cost push inflation to happen. The fourth one is basically what we call tax push inflation. Tax push inflation is where the government basically increases what we call indirect taxes, and that results in cost of production to rise, though artificially, but price level to go up. Now there's a question that comes in exam: how much is government responsible for inflation? And you can say this, where the government is responsible when it comes to indirect taxes. Government is responsible for tax push inflation, and similarly when you look at AD curve, AD is C plus I plus G, so the government is responsible here as well, where the government can be increasing aggregate demand as well, causing therefore demand pull inflation to happen. So these were the demand pull and cost push reasons. Now the third inflation that I want to talk about is what we call monetary inflation. Monetary inflation is basically when we say there is a rise in money supply, which in turn causes basically what we call excess liquidity or too much cash in the hands of people, which means people will now spend more of the extra cash, and that in turn means aggregate demand will rise, which can make us to have a rise in price level. So basically higher liquidity in the market basically can cause people to spend more, and that in turn can cause price level to go up. Now this kind of like rise in sort of liquidity because money supply going up is not bad if the increase in output is compensating for it. What I mean to say is, for example, if there is a, let's say GDP is growing every year by 5% and money supply is kind of like going up by 4%, then that's great because output is rising faster than basically a rise in money supply. You will never have a case where more money will be chasing fewer goods, but that doesn't really happen in a monetary inflation. Basically what we say is that if the economy doesn't have that spare capacity, if the output isn't really rising fast, when the government end up increasing money supply, that's when basically your price level will go up. And when the price level goes up, of course, we know the value of money goes down. Now another way to look at this is basically through what we call the quantity theory of money. According to the quantity theory of money, let me write this theory of money, we also know this that inflation can happen. How? Well, the quantity theory of money says MV equals to PT, where M is the money supply in an economy, V is the velocity or number of times money changes hands, P is the price level, which is of course what tells us inflation, and T is what we call quantity of goods or number of transactions that happen. Now let me explain this equation first before we talk about how can we use this to find inflation in an economy. So let's take a simple example. Let's say there's an economy that makes 100 units of a good. So T is equal to 100. Remember, T is quantity. They make 100 units of a good, and let's say the price of a good is let's say $5. So PT basically means your nominal GDP or your value of the GDP at current prices. Let's say 100 times 5, or it is $500. So if an economy makes 100 units and each unit is for $5, then the value of the GDP is $500, right? Now if government prints money supply equal to $500 as well, so government prints $500 worth of notes, then what will that mean? Well, if the government prints $500 worth of note, then velocity will be PT over M, which is going to be 500 over 500, which is going to be 1, which means simply that the money has to change hand one time to get the $500 worth of transaction to happen. Now what do we mean by one time? Let's take an example. Let's say, what if the government doesn't print $500 worth of money? Let's say government prints, let's say only $100 worth of money, which means the government is printing much less than what is needed out there. So what will then be the case where V is equal to PT over M, which is going to be 500 over 100 or 5. Now money has to change hand 5 times to make $100 worth of transaction happen. So for example, let's say people have the money, so when they go and transact this money, they will only be able to buy at any one time $100 worth of transaction. Now 5 times if the money changes hand, let's say individual A get the money from individual B because he sold those goods, so that's basically going to happen 5 times for these many dollar worth of transaction to happen. So what we say is that, as you can see from this PT is constant, if the value of GDP is constant, if the government keeps on increasing money supply, the velocity or the need for money to change hands will go down. So the idea goes this, that higher the money supply, lower the velocity, and similarly lower the money supply, higher the velocity, keeping PT or value of GDP, nominal GDP, to be constant. Now, how do we use this to explain inflation? Well, according to the monetarists, this is what the monetarist view is. Let me write this. According to the monetarists argue that this is useful, MV is equal to PT is useful in explaining inflation. What they say is that V and T are constant. So let me write this, V and T are constant. Constant means they do not change at all in a time period. If T and V are constant, I'm going to tell you why they say that. Then basically what they mean to say is this, that they can be totally ignored from the equation because they don't really change, they're just constant, which means if the money supply goes up, it will make the price level go up as well. This means that money supply directly contributes for the price level to go up, which means inflation to happen. Now, why is V and T constant? According to them, T is constant because T is simply your output or the quantity of goods that you make, and they say that this depends on your factors of production or inputs, right? And that basically means these factors of production do not change that much because they are relatively fixed in a time period, and that basically means T is not changing too much. And even if it does, your money supply would not make it change. Your money supply would not be a reason why T can change, because there could be other factors that can contribute for the T to change. Similarly, this is V is basically your number of time money is changing hands, and the reason why money changes hands from one person to another is because of somebody's, what they say, spending pattern. And this spending pattern, according to the monetarists, is also constant. So if this spending pattern is also constant, this means V doesn't change, and that basically means whenever money supply goes up, because spending pattern doesn't change, is constant, then automatically price level goes up. So according to the monetarists, the reason why a rise in money supply causes the price level to go up is because V and T are constant. Now Keynesians disagree with it. Keynesians say this, that V and T do not necessarily need to be constant, but that's something we can discuss on a later discussion. So these are the three causes of inflation that one needs to know when it comes to exams. And what is also important to know is basically when you're writing an answer for monetary inflation, you need to give both the explanation. One is basically higher money supply can lead to higher aggregate demand and therefore price level to rise, and also the quantity theory of money, which says that V and T are constant.